"You're no longer needed here." Caleb's voice rang out coldly, his words piercing through the silence of the living room like a sharp blade. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even frustration, just a flat, emotionless statement. The kind of declaration one might make when cutting ties with something they no longer want. Arthur stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just been said. His son, the boy he had raised with love and sacrifice, had just dismissed him. No yelling. No anger, just cold, calculated indifference. His son, standing there before him, had become a stranger who now saw Arthur as nothing more than a burden to be dealt with. The room was suffocating in its silence. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, an ever-present reminder of how empty the space had become. Mara, Arthur's daughter-in-law, sat across from him on the couch, her smile too polite, too practiced. It wasn't a smile of warmth, but of victory. It was as if she had won and Arthur had lost, not a battle of words, but of existence. Arthur felt his hands tremble as he gripped his old watch, a gift from his father, a symbol of time, of family, of everything he had worked for. But now the watch felt like a weight, a burden, reminding him of what had been lost. His family had become strangers, and his life, his history, was being erased in real time. "We've found a great place for you, Arthur." Mara continued, her voice smooth but cold. "It's not a nursing home, it's a community living center. It has activities, chef-prepared meals, and you'll have your own space. You'll be well taken care of." Arthur heard her words, but they didn't register as concern or care. It was a plan, her plan, Caleb's plan, a plan that didn't include him. A place to store him away so they wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of caring for him anymore. "What happens to my room?" Arthur asked, his voice steady, but inside everything was crumbling. "What happens to my tools?" Mara responded quickly, as though this had been discussed 1,000 times before. "We've made space in the garage." Caleb cleared a shelf, "and for the truck, we'll call Gary about it. It's not safe for you to drive something that big anymore." Arthur didn't answer. The words didn't sting. They just settled into his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was simply empty. This wasn't a family making hard decisions out of love. This was a family making plans out of convenience. "You're not contributing emotionally," Mara added, her tone sugar-sweet but full of venom. "It's not healthy for the kids." Arthur stood there, his body frozen in place, not out of fear, but because he was trying to make sense of it all. He had built this house with his own hands. Every room, every corner was filled with memories of his life, of the life he had worked for, and now he was being cast aside. Treated like an old coat to be discarded. He wasn't even being asked to leave. He was being told to leave. Mara didn't wait for him to respond. She slid a manila folder toward him, filled with papers that had already been prepared. All he had to do was sign, and the decision would be final. A signature was all that stood between him and being erased from their lives, from this home, from everything. Arthur didn't move. He stared at the folder. The papers that represented the end of his place in this family. His son, his daughter-in-law had made up their minds for him. He wasn't a part of this anymore, not really. And now they were just waiting for him to sign on the dotted line to seal his fate. But Arthur didn't sign. He didn't react. He simply stood there, not defeated, but resolute. He knew that if he signed, it would all be over. They would have control. But if he didn't, if he just stood here in silence, they would see the cracks in their plan. The truth of what they were doing would finally sink in. Arthur wasn't ready to give up, not yet, and the silence in the room, that cold, suffocating silence, was the beginning of his response. They may have thought they were making all the decisions, but Arthur still had a few moves left. Arthur Reed had lived in this house for as long as he could remember. It wasn't just a building to him. It was the embodiment of his entire life, the heart of all his memories. Every brick, every nail, every beam that held the structure together told the story of his family, of the love, hard work, and sacrifice he'd poured into creating a home for them. It was a home where laughter echoed in the halls and where he had built a life he was proud of. Arthur wasn't a man of many words. He was quiet, methodical, and believed in action. He'd spent his life doing what was necessary to provide for his family, building a stable, quiet life. He wasn't flashy, he didn't crave attention. He simply wanted to do his part and be there for his family. But now, as he stood in the living room, those very same walls that had once been filled with warmth and love, felt like they were closing in on him. It wasn't just the house that made him who he was. It was everything it represented: his family, his wife Ruth, their son Caleb, and everything they had worked for together. Ruth, his late wife, had been his anchor. She had kept him grounded, her wisdom and love serving as the guiding light in his life. But with her gone, something shifted. The balance that had held them all together slowly began to unravel. Arthur's relationship with Caleb had been a source of pride for him. Caleb had always been his son, the one he took fishing, the one he helped with schoolwork, the one he taught the values of hard work and loyalty. But as the years went by, something began to change in Caleb. His calls grew shorter, his visits less frequent. It wasn't that they fought, but the bond that had once been so strong between them began to fade, slowly but surely. Arthur hadn't wanted to admit it, but the signs were all there. Then came Mara, Caleb's wife. She was polite and pleasant. But Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that she saw him as a relic, a burden, someone to be dealt with, like an old piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. She was practical, always thinking ahead, always focused on efficiency. Arthur didn't mind that she was independent, but he could sense her impatience, her desire to move forward, and it made him uneasy. After Ruth passed, Arthur had tried his best to hold on to the family unit. He had hoped that Caleb would step up, that they could come together to honor the life they had built. But as the months turned into years, it became clear that Caleb was no longer the same man who had once looked up to him. He was becoming more like his wife, detached, logical, and seemingly uninterested in the emotional ties that had once held their family together. The bond between father and son that had once been so strong was weakening, and Arthur felt it in every conversation that was now reduced to businesslike exchanges, devoid of any real connection. It wasn't just the emotional distance that hurt, though. It was the decisions being made about his life. For the first time in decades, Arthur felt like an outsider in his own home. He was being treated like a burden. His son and daughter-in-law were making decisions without consulting him, as if his presence in the family had become optional. It was as if he had been erased, made invisible by the very people he had loved and cared for all his life. Arthur had tried to fight the growing sense of isolation, tried to convince himself that they were just being practical. But deep down he knew better. This wasn't practicality. This was the beginning of something much worse. His family, the ones he had worked so hard to provide for, were now looking for a way to get rid of him. And the most painful part was that they had planned it all without him. When Mara had first mentioned the community living facility, Arthur had dismissed it as a joke, but as the weeks went on, he realized it wasn't a joke. They had already made arrangements, already decided on his future without even asking for his opinion. It was as if he had become an afterthought, something to be dealt with, a problem to be solved. Mara was quick to assure him that it wasn't a nursing home. "It's more like a community living space," she had said, her voice smooth and calculated, but Arthur wasn't fooled. She wasn't offering him care out of love or concern, she was offering him convenience. She and Caleb had made up their minds for him, and all that was left was for him to sign the papers and disappear into the background of their lives. Arthur was no fool. He knew that signing those papers would be the end of his place in the family. He would no longer be the father, the man who had worked his entire life to provide for them. He would simply be a name on a form. An old man shoved into a corner of their world where they wouldn't have to deal with him. He would be erased. And so, as Caleb and Mara sat there waiting for him to comply, Arthur stood silent. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He simply stared at the papers in front of him, feeling the weight of the decision they were forcing on him. But even as the silence stretched on, Arthur knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to let go. Not yet, not without a fight. The house that he had built, the life he had crafted, was not something he would just walk away from. Not without making them understand what they were taking from him. And although his hands trembled as he reached for the manila folder, Arthur knew that this was only the beginning. He wasn't going to sign anything just yet. He needed time. Time to think, time to process, and time to make sure that when the time came, he would make them see the truth. They thought they could push him out, erase him from their lives. But Arthur had spent a lifetime building something far more important than just a house. He had built a legacy, and he would be damned if he let them destroy it without a fight. That day, Arthur Reed had no idea that his life was about to be torn apart in a way he had never imagined. The morning started like any other. Sunlight streamed through the windows, the soft chirping of birds in the distance, and the comforting crispness of the fall air that crept into the house. He took a deep breath, the scent of the old wood and faded furniture filling his lungs, a scent that he had grown accustomed to over the years. But as soon as he stepped into the living room, the unease that had been building inside him over the past months finally began to settle in. The moment he walked in, he saw it, the tense silence hanging in the air, the way Mara sat perched on the edge of the couch, hands clasped together, her lips set in a tight, controlled smile. It wasn't a smile of warmth or love, it was calculated, almost rehearsed. Caleb, his son, was sitting across from her, his posture stiff and unyielding, as if he was deliberately avoiding making eye contact with his father. The air in the room felt heavier, and Arthur immediately sensed that something had shifted. This wasn't a normal family discussion. "Dad, we need to talk," Caleb spoke first, but his tone was distant, as if he was reading a script he had memorized. His words didn't carry the weight of affection, as they once did when he was younger. There was no tenderness in his voice. No hint of the boy who had once asked him for advice, for guidance. No, this was the voice of a man who had already made up his mind, who was no longer willing to listen to reason, to feel compassion. Arthur, though his heart was sinking, remained still. He glanced at his son, who was now a man with hard lines on his face, a man who no longer seemed to recognize him as the father who had cared for him, guided him, and been there for every milestone in his life. Arthur's hands, trembling slightly, reached for the armrest as he slowly sat down across from Caleb. "What is it, son?" Arthur asked, his voice steady but laced with an underlying pain. It wasn't just the conversation he feared, it was the weight of knowing that his son was about to tell him something that would change everything. There had been tension in their relationship for months now, but he never imagined it would come to this. Mara, never one to let silence linger, spoke up next. Her voice smooth as she leaned forward slightly. "Arthur," she said, "we've talked about this before. It's time. You need to move out." Her words hung in the air like a guillotine, sharp and unyielding. It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't an offer, it was a command. "We've found a place for you. It's perfect. It's not a nursing home," she added, her words carefully crafted to sound reassuring. "It's a community living arrangement, meals, activities, and you'll have your own space. It's exactly what you need." Arthur felt his breath catch in his throat. A community living arrangement. A cold wave washed over him. He had heard these words before, but never like this. It was as if they had been rehearsed, practiced for just the right moment, and now the curtain had risen and the play was unfolding. The decision had already been made for him without his input, without his consent. He could feel the room spinning around him. His mind raced back to the time when Ruth was still alive, when things were simpler, when their family was united. How many times had he worked late into the night, sacrificing his time and energy to ensure that they had everything they needed? How many hours had he spent fixing things around the house, repairing fences, patching walls, always with a sense of pride, always knowing that it was for them, his family. But now everything he had built, everything he had worked for, seemed to be slipping away like sand through his fingers. Arthur's gaze flickered to Caleb, whose face was now a mask of indifference. It was as if the son he had raised with love and care had turned into a stranger overnight. A stranger who was willing to make decisions for him, decisions that would impact the rest of his life without even consulting him. He wanted to speak, to protest, to demand that they reconsider, but the words wouldn't come. He was overwhelmed by a sense of betrayal that was too deep for words. "Arthur," Mara continued, her voice softening as if to placate him, "this is for your own good. We've found a place that will take care of you and you'll be able to live your life in peace. No more worrying about the house, about maintenance. You won't have to burden us anymore." Burden, the word hit Arthur like a blow to the chest. Burden, that's what he had become to them. Was that how they saw him now? His son, his flesh and blood, the person he had dedicated his life to raising, had reduced him to nothing more than a liability, someone to be disposed of when they no longer felt like dealing with him. The house that had once been a symbol of their family, of everything they had shared, was now a symbol of his irrelevance. His heart ached as the enormity of it all sank in. "What happens to my room?" Arthur asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't arguing, he simply wanted to understand. "What happens to all my things, the tools he had collected over the years, the things that had helped him build this home? This life, were they just going to be tossed aside? Were they going to be forgotten like he was?" Mara didn't flinch, she had prepared for this. We've cleared space in the garage. Caleb set aside a shelf for your things, and as for the truck, she said, glancing at Caleb, we can call Gary to take it off our hands. It's not safe for you to drive something so big anymore, Arthur. The words stung more than he expected. The truck, his old F-150. The one he had painstakingly fixed up, the one that had been with him through thick and thin, was now something that needed to be taken off their hands. He had spent countless hours working on that truck, keeping it running, fixing it up when it broke down, and now it was a burden too, just like him. Arthur sat there, his mind racing, trying to process everything that was happening. He couldn't focus on the details, the words, the plans. All he could focus on was the way they had dismissed him, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience, a relic from the past that no longer fit into their future. "Don't you think you're rushing this?" Arthur asked, his voice barely audible now. "I need more time to think. You can't just expect me to sign these papers and leave." Mara's smile faltered for a moment, but only for a second. "We don't have time, Arthur. We've already made all the arrangements. You need to make a decision." The words hung in the air like a trap closing in. Arthur could feel it, the weight of their expectations, the pressure to comply, to sign the papers and simply walk away from everything he had ever known. But in that moment, something inside him shifted. His mind was no longer racing with panic, but with determination. He wasn't ready to let go, not yet. "I need time," Arthur repeated, more firmly this time. "I won't sign anything until I've had time to think." Mara let out a deep sigh, as if she were disappointed but not surprised. Caleb looked at him, the anger in his eyes hidden behind a wall of indifference. "Fine," Caleb said, standing up. "Take all the time you need, but don't expect us to wait forever." Arthur watched as they both left the room, the weight of their words lingering in the air. He could feel the walls closing in around him, but he wasn't ready to give in. Not yet, not without a fight. He looked around the living room, the space that had once been filled with love, with family. The furniture, the pictures on the walls. The shelves lined with mementos, all of it now seemed like a prison. A prison of his own making, a prison that had been built by love and sacrifice, but now it was a prison of betrayal and loss. Arthur walked to the window and looked out at the yard. He could see the maple tree in the distance, its branches swaying in the wind. He thought about the years he had spent working in this very yard, tending to the garden, fixing the fence, making this house a home. He thought about the long nights he had spent with Ruth, planning their future, building their life together. Now it seemed like all of that had been in vain, but Arthur wasn't ready to give up just yet. He wouldn't sign those papers, not without a fight, not without making them understand what they had done. Arthur woke up the next morning with the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had barely slept. His mind had kept racing, playing over the conversation from the previous day, those harsh words from Caleb, Mara's cold, calculated smile, and the realization that his own flesh and blood had turned their backs on him. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide what to do next. But inside, there was no clarity, only chaos. The walls that had once felt like a home now felt like they were closing in. The furniture that had been placed so carefully, the photographs on the wall, the old furniture they had all shared together, each item now felt like a ghost, a reminder of what once was a life that was slipping away. Arthur could hardly look at any of it without feeling the sting of betrayal. Every corner of the house was filled with memories, and each memory felt like it was turning against him. Ruth was gone, and now so was everything he had built. He stumbled out of bed, his body aching, the weight of the cane in his hand almost too much to bear. His legs felt heavy, as if they no longer had the strength to carry him through the day. He moved slowly, dragging his feet, feeling every inch of his age and every second of his despair. Arthur made his way to the kitchen, trying to gather the strength to make a cup of coffee. His hands were shaking, and when he reached for the mug, he nearly knocked it over. He caught it just in time, his fingers stiff and uncoordinated. The sound of the mug hitting the counter felt like a scream in the silence of the house. It was as though everything in the world was falling apart, and he was the only one who knew it. As the coffee brewed, Arthur sat down at the table, staring out the window at the yard. He could see the maple tree in the distance, its branches swaying in the breeze. It was a beautiful sight, but all he could feel was the weight of what had happened. The betrayal wasn't just about losing his place in the house. It was about losing his family, his legacy, everything that he had worked so hard to create. How had it come to this? How had the people he loved and trusted turned against him so quickly? How had his son, his own flesh and blood, become someone who could sign his name to a paper that would remove him from his life? The pain was unbearable. It wasn't just the thought of leaving the house, it was the thought that Caleb, the person he had invested his entire life into, no longer cared about him. That his love, his sacrifices, meant nothing to his son anymore. Arthur had always believed that family was everything, that love and loyalty were the foundation of life, but now it seemed like nothing but empty words. He thought about Ruth again, the woman he had loved for so many years. They had built this life together. Brick by brick, raising Caleb, creating a home full of memories. Ruth had always been his anchor, the one who kept him grounded when things got tough. She had been his partner in everything, and now, without her, he felt lost. Arthur's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening. It was Caleb coming downstairs, his movements stiff and mechanical. Arthur didn't say anything at first. He simply watched as Caleb walked into the kitchen, his eyes not meeting his father's. "Morning, Dad," Caleb muttered, his voice flat, emotionless. Arthur didn't answer. What was there to say? Caleb had already made his choice. There was nothing left to discuss. Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee, his back to Arthur. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Arthur wanted to say something, to confront him, to make him understand how much pain he was causing, but the words wouldn't come. He was too numb, too lost in the grief of it all. "Are you still thinking about signing the papers?" Caleb asked suddenly, his tone sharp, as though he was growing impatient. "We need to finalize everything, Dad. It's the only way forward." Arthur felt a pang in his chest. The only way forward. Was this really the end of everything? Was this how it would all end for him? Was his son really telling him that the only way forward was for him to walk away from everything he had worked for, from everything he had ever known? The tears burned in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had spent too many years being strong for his family, being the one they could always count on. He couldn't let them see him break now, even if his soul felt like it was shattering. "I'm not signing anything," Arthur said finally, his voice low but firm. His hands were trembling as he gripped the mug, his knuckles white with the effort. "Not until I've had time to think." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't say anything at all. Instead, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts and the crushing weight of his despair. Arthur's world felt empty now. The house, once filled with the laughter and voices of his family, now felt like a hollow shell. Even the furniture seemed to mock him, each item a reminder of what he had lost. The silence in the house was deafening. He couldn't stay here forever, he knew that, but the thought of leaving, of signing away his life, made him feel like he was surrendering to them, surrendering to the cold, calculated plans of his family. They had already decided his fate, but what if he didn't go? What if he stayed and fought for his place? What if he didn't let them erase him like this? Arthur knew that the road ahead would be difficult. His body was weakening and time was not on his side, but his spirit, his will to survive, was not yet broken. If his family wanted him gone, they would have to fight for it, because Arthur wasn't going down without a fight. He spent the rest of the day in silence, walking through the house, touching the things that had meant so much to him over the years. He stopped by the stairs, his fingers brushing against the wood railing, feeling the worn texture of the banister that had been there since Caleb was a child. He looked at the pictures on the wall, family vacations, birthdays, holidays. He had lived a full life here, and it was being taken from him. The tears came then, not in a rush, but in a quiet, steady stream. He didn't try to stop them. He let himself grieve for what he had lost, for the family that had once meant everything to him. And yet, as he stood there, alone in the house that had been his sanctuary, he felt something stirring inside him. It was small at first, but it was there, a flicker of something stronger than grief. This wasn't over, not yet. Arthur wiped his eyes. His heart heavy, but his mind clear. He would find a way to fight back. He would find a way to make them see what they had done, because he wasn't done yet. Arthur sat still in his room, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him. His house was silent now, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, the kind that whispers of tension and unfinished business. It had been a week since the conversation with Caleb and Mara, the day they tried to push him out, to strip him of everything he had worked for. The emotional turmoil he had endured was now giving way to something different, a shift. A change inside him that he couldn't quite explain yet. It wasn't just about the anger or the betrayal anymore. It wasn't even about the sadness, although that still lingered. This was something deeper, something that began to form inside his chest, quietly but steadily, like a seed taking root. The past few days had been a blur of planning, of careful thoughts that Arthur kept to himself. It was no longer just about surviving the loss of his family and his home. It was about finding a way to regain control of his life, his choices, his dignity. Arthur had always prided himself on being a man who could handle anything, who had built his life from the ground up. But somewhere along the way that had been taken from him, and he had to decide if he was going to allow it to stay gone or if he would take back what was his. It was the quiet moments that spoke the loudest now. As Arthur sat in the stillness of his room, he allowed himself to listen to the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the creak of the floorboards as the house settled into its familiar rhythms. He could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside, the sound of life continuing without him. And it was in these quiet moments that he began to realize something. He had been living in a state of emotional paralysis for far too long. He had let the betrayal of his family, the betrayal of Caleb, Mara, and even his own memories, keep him from moving forward, but that had to change. The emotional chaos he had been living with, the suffocating grief, the overwhelming anger was no longer serving him. It had been holding him back, making him feel helpless, powerless, and Arthur was no longer going to allow that to define him. Arthur stood up from the chair, feeling the slight ache in his knees as he did so. The cane in his hand was more than just a tool for walking now. It had become a symbol of his journey, a symbol of what he had endured and of what he was now beginning to realize he could overcome. His eyes wandered to the window, the same window he had stared out of countless times throughout his life. The view hadn't changed. The trees were still there, the horizon still stretched out before him, but he had changed. He was different now, and he couldn't deny it. He had always thought of himself as a man of action, someone who could solve any problem with his hands, someone who could fix what was broken. But now, as he looked at his reflection in the window, he realized that his greatest strength had never been in fixing things. It had always been in enduring, in holding on, in knowing that even when things seemed hopeless, he still had the power to choose his next move. This wasn't the end of his story, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of something new. He had been living in the shadow of his past, the shadow of Ruth's death, the shadow of his son's betrayal, the shadow of his own fading health. But now, for the first time in a long while, he saw a different path opening up before him. It was a path that wasn't defined by the choices of others, a path that wasn't confined to the walls of this house. Arthur reached over and grabbed the green notebook he had been writing in, the one that had become his confidante in the last few days. He opened it slowly, the familiar pages offering him a sense of comfort. As he read through his notes, his thoughts began to organize themselves. He was no longer just reacting to what had happened, he was planning, he was thinking ahead, he was strategizing. In that moment, Arthur realized that his inner shift had begun. It wasn't a sudden change, but a quiet transformation that had been happening little by little, day by day. He had stopped focusing solely on the pain of betrayal. Instead, he was beginning to focus on what he could control, his own actions, his own decisions, his own future. The days that followed were filled with reflection and subtle action. Arthur had learned to live in the quiet space between thought and action, between anger and understanding. He started walking around the house with a renewed sense of purpose, not just for himself, but for the life he had built here. He would stand at the window and look out at the yard, seeing not just the trees and the dirt, but the memories that lay beneath them. He remembered planting the garden with Ruth. How they had spent hours picking out seeds, deciding what would grow best in their soil. He remembered the long nights he spent in the garage, fixing the old truck, feeling the weight of the grease and the metal beneath his hands. And as he stood there now, he realized that even though the house was filled with ghosts, it was still his house. And even though his family had turned their backs on him, it was still his family. Arthur began to understand something that had eluded him before, that he didn't need to rely on anyone else's approval to move forward. He didn't need Mara or Caleb to tell him what to do, and he certainly didn't need their validation. He had spent his life living for others, trying to make sure they were happy, trying to make sure they had everything they needed. But now he realized it was time for him to live for himself. It was on the third day after the conversation with Caleb that Arthur decided to take action. He knew that the time for words had passed. Now it was time for him to show his family. To show the world that he wasn't ready to fade away. He wasn't going to sign those papers. He wasn't going to let Mara and Caleb erase him from his own life. But he also knew that this wouldn't be an easy fight. He had to be strategic. He had to outsmart them, outthink them. They had been planning for months, and now it was his turn to plan. Arthur spent the next few days organizing his thoughts, revisiting his old files, and making phone calls to the people who could help him. He reached out to Daniel, his younger brother, who was an attorney. He didn't ask for his help directly, he simply asked for advice. He needed to know what legal protections he still had, what rights he could invoke, and when he spoke to Daniel, he could hear the surprise in his brother's voice. "You're still fighting this?" Daniel had asked, his voice hesitant. "I'm not giving up yet," Arthur had replied firmly. Over the next few days, Arthur built his case quietly, carefully. He didn't want to confront Caleb and Mara just yet. He knew that the power of patience was on his side. He started going through his legal documents, reading over the fine print, making sure that he knew exactly what his rights were. He reached out to the bank to make sure that his name was still on the deed to the house. He made sure that every detail was in place. Arthur knew that the real battle wasn't about the house. It was about his dignity. It was about showing Caleb and Mara that they couldn't erase him, that they couldn't push him out of his own life. And with each passing day, his resolve grew stronger. As the week went on, Arthur's sense of clarity deepened. He began to recognize the power that silence had given him. He had been so used to reacting to everything around him, to feeling the weight of other people's decisions on his shoulders. But now, in the stillness, he had found something more powerful than anger. He had found resolve. When Caleb and Mara approached him again, asking him to sign the papers, Arthur didn't immediately refuse. Instead, he calmly took the papers from the table and studied them. "Take your time," Mara said, her voice trying to sound friendly, though Arthur could hear the edge in her words. "I will," Arthur replied without emotion. He didn't need to explain himself anymore. His actions, his resolve would speak for him. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to plead. He was going to stand firm in his own decisions. Arthur had spent weeks plotting. The tension in his bones had eased slightly, but the calm he felt was not one of surrender, it was one of preparation. The house had grown quiet. Caleb and Mara were still trying to play the roles they'd written for themselves, trying to convince him that everything was fine, that moving to the community facility was just the best option for everyone. But Arthur wasn't fooled anymore. He saw through the thin veneer of concern they were trying to sell him. It was all about control, not care. Arthur could feel their impatience growing. Every word they spoke, every gesture was calculated to make him feel like an inconvenience, like a burden that needed to be removed as soon as possible. But what they didn't realize was that the longer they waited, the more they underestimated him. The more they believed he was weak, the stronger he became. For the first time in years, Arthur wasn't acting out of anger. He wasn't seeking vengeance for the betrayal. They had already lost that battle. No, Arthur was playing the long game now. He was going to show them just how wrong they were to think they could control his life so easily. He had already begun to lay the groundwork. It was during one of his evening walks around the yard, the crisp air biting at his skin, that Arthur decided the time had come. He stood still for a moment by the maple tree, the one Ruth had planted so many years ago, and watched as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The shadows stretched long across the grass, and Arthur knew that his time had finally arrived. For the past few weeks, Arthur had been biding his time, gathering information, contacting people who could help him, and making sure his legal standing was secure. He had consulted with Daniel, his brother, who had advised him on how to use his legal rights. He had reached out to old friends and colleagues, quietly planting seeds of doubt, making sure that people in the community knew what was happening under his roof. Every conversation he had, whether with a neighbor, a local shopkeeper, or even the mailman, was carefully calculated. He had started to spread the truth, but in a way that no one could trace back to him. Arthur had spent so many years being the quiet one in his family, the one who worked hard in silence, never asking for much. But he had learned something valuable during his years of hard labor and quiet sacrifice. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who controls the situation. His strength had always been in his patience, his ability to endure, but now it was time for that patience to pay off. Caleb and Mara had no idea what was coming. Arthur didn't have to do anything dramatic. He didn't have to shout or make threats. His quiet resilience was his weapon. His plan was simple but effective. Let them think they had control. Let them think that the papers were already signed and that the house was already theirs. Let them believe they were erasing him, pushing him out. But the truth was he had already prepared for their every move. It all began with a simple, innocuous question. Arthur had been quiet, methodical, waiting for the right moment. He knew that Caleb and Mara were growing increasingly impatient. They were getting frustrated with his refusal to sign the papers, but they didn't know the full extent of his plan. Arthur could see it in their faces. They thought they had him cornered, that they could pressure him into compliance. One evening after dinner, Caleb sat down across from Arthur in the living room, his posture tense, his eyes not meeting his father's. It was the first time in weeks that they had shared a room together without words of reproach or guilt hanging in the air. Caleb finally spoke, his voice tinged with frustration. "Dad, we need to finalize this. You can't keep dragging this out. The notary's already been scheduled and we've got to get this over with," Caleb said. "We're trying to do the right thing. Why can't you see that?" Arthur didn't respond immediately. He let the words sit in the air, let the silence build. Caleb fidgeted with his hands, his eyes darting around the room, not able to hold his gaze for long. Arthur let out a slow breath, then finally spoke, his voice calm but steady. "You think this is the right thing?" Arthur asked. "You think that pushing me out of my own house is doing the right thing?" Caleb's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "It's not like that," he said defensively. "We're just trying to make sure you're okay. This is what's best for you." Arthur leaned forward in his chair, his hands resting on his cane, and stared into Caleb's eyes. "What's best for me?" Arthur repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "You think sending me away to some community is what's best for me? No, Caleb. What's best for you and Mara is getting rid of me. You think I don't see it. You think I don't know what you're really after." The air between them grew thick with unspoken words. Caleb's jaw tightened, and Arthur could see the conflict in his son's eyes. For the first time in a long while, Arthur saw the boy who had once looked up to him, the boy who had asked him for guidance. But now that boy was a man who had turned his back on him, a man who had chosen convenience over family. "I'm not signing anything, Caleb," Arthur said firmly, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "You can keep pushing, keep playing your little games, but I won't sign, not until I've had time to think." Caleb looked like he wanted to say something more, but he stopped himself. He stood up, the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air. He didn't know how to fight back, and he knew his father wasn't going to give in. There was nothing he could say to make Arthur change his mind, so he left without another word. The day Caleb and Mara had been waiting for finally arrived, the day the notary was scheduled to come and finalize everything. Arthur had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now, as he sat in his chair, waiting for them to arrive, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had already taken the necessary steps. He had spoken to the bank. He had talked to Daniel. He had made sure that everything was in place. Arthur had set up the legal roadblocks. Every document he needed was ready. The lien on the house, the documents that tied his name to the deed, were secure. If Caleb and Mara tried to proceed with their plan to sell or refinance the house without his signature, they would hit a wall. The notary arrived promptly, his polite greeting a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Arthur watched as Caleb and Mara made their way to the table, their faces strained but trying to remain composed. They didn't know that they were walking straight into a trap. They didn't realize that the pieces were already in motion, that the ground beneath them was slowly shifting. Arthur didn't speak as they laid the documents before him. He simply watched, his gaze steady and unwavering. He knew they expected him to sign. They thought he had been defeated, that he was too old, too weak to fight back. But Arthur had other plans. He wasn't going to make it easy for them. Mara, trying to mask her anxiety, turned to Arthur with a forced smile. "We just need you to sign here, Arthur," she said, tapping the paper in front of him. "This is for your own good. It'll all be settled once you do." Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly reached for the pen, his fingers brushing the surface of the paper. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting, watching. They thought he was going to fold, but Arthur wasn't ready to sign just yet. He had something else in mind. "I've read the documents," Arthur said calmly, "but before I sign, I want to make sure you understand what this really means." Caleb and Mara exchanged a brief glance, unsure of what their father was getting at, but they didn't interrupt. They waited for him to continue. Arthur looked up at them, his voice low but clear. "I've spent my life working for this house, for this family," he said, his words deliberate. I've put my heart and soul into making sure you had everything you needed, and now you're trying to take it all away. But let me tell you something, I'm not done yet, not by a long shot. Arthur's words hung in the air like a challenge. Caleb and Mara could feel the shift in the room, the subtle change in power. They had underestimated their father, thinking he was too weak to fight back, too old to cause any real trouble. But Arthur had been patient. And now the storm was coming. The notary, sensing the tension, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He seemed uneasy, unsure of what was happening, but he remained silent. Arthur didn't need the notary's approval. He had already made his move. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a file that Caleb and Mara hadn't seen before. He laid it on the table in front of them, and the sound of it hitting the surface felt like a thunderclap. "This is a copy of the deed," Arthur said, his voice steady. "And this," he tapped the file, "is the lien I put on this house years ago. You can't move forward without my signature. You can't sell it, refinance it, or do anything with it without my consent." Caleb's face drained of color. He reached for the file, his fingers trembling, and opened it. He scanned the papers quickly, and the reality of what his father had done hit him like a ton of bricks. "You're lying," Caleb said. His voice barely above a whisper, but the doubt in his words was clear. Arthur smiled coldly. "I don't lie, Caleb. I've been planning this for months. You thought you could push me out of my own life, but you didn't realize that I was already one step ahead. You don't have control anymore." Mara's expression faltered. She looked at the notary, who was now visibly uncomfortable. We can't move forward like this," she said, her voice shaking. Arthur stood up, his posture unwavering. "No, you can't. Not unless you understand what it means to truly own something. You don't just take it from someone else, you earn it." With that, the first crack in their carefully constructed plans appeared. Caleb and Mara were left speechless, realizing for the first time that they had been outmaneuvered. Arthur wasn't just a man clinging to the past. He was a man reclaiming his future, and this was just the beginning of his payback. The morning after the confrontation, everything seemed to settle into an eerie stillness. The house, which had once been filled with the sounds of busy lives, of rushed conversations and the clatter of dishes, now felt like a space that held its breath. The events of the previous day were still fresh in Arthur's mind, but as he sat by the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, the world outside seemed to move in slow motion. He wasn't sure what time it was, only that the sun had barely risen. And the first few rays of light peeked through the curtains. The kitchen felt colder than usual, though it wasn't the temperature that made it feel so. There was a palpable absence, an emptiness, and it wasn't just from the physical absence of his son and daughter-in-law. It was a more profound kind of silence that seemed to echo through the walls. The house, which had once been a home filled with laughter and love, now felt like a place of reflection. A place where the past and present collided and everything had come to a halt. Arthur didn't mind the quiet. In fact, he welcomed it. It gave him time to think, time to reflect on everything that had happened, everything he had endured. He had always been a man of action, someone who fixed things, who worked hard to make sure everything around him was in place. But now, as he sat at the table, he realized that sometimes the most important thing was to simply pause. To let the stillness sink in and allow it to speak to him. As he stared at his reflection in the window, the lines on his face seemed to tell the story of a man who had lived a full life, a life of struggle, of love, of loss. He had seen so much, experienced so much, and yet in this moment he felt like he was standing on the edge of something new. The past, with all its pain and betrayal, was still there, but it no longer had the power to control him. He had regained his strength, his resolve, and for the first time in a long time he felt the weight of it lifting. Arthur took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth seep into his chest. He thought about Ruth, about the years they had spent together in this house. The memories of their shared moments, quiet dinners, long conversations on the porch, the laughter that filled the rooms came rushing back, and for a moment it felt as though she was still there with him. But Ruth was gone. And Arthur had learned to live with that. It had been hard, unbearably hard, but it had also been the beginning of his transformation. Ruth had always been the strong one, the one who kept the family together. She had always believed in the importance of family, of loyalty, and of love. And though Arthur had lost her, he had not lost the lessons she had taught him. He remembered the words she used to say, "Patience is the strongest thing you can have, Arthur. Not every fight needs to be loud. Sometimes." The quietest moments are the ones that speak the loudest. Those words resonated with him now more than ever. He had been patient, he had endured, he had waited for the right moment to act, and now the pieces were falling into place. He had turned the tables on Caleb and Mara, not with force, but with quiet determination. He had reclaimed his dignity, his home, and his sense of self. And as he sat in the stillness of the kitchen, he realized that this was the most profound victory of all. The battle wasn't over yet, he knew that. Caleb and Mara had not given up, and they would continue to push, continue to try to make him bend to their will. But Arthur wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced the worst of it, betrayal, loneliness, despair, and he had come out the other side stronger. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a loud voice or a fist thrown in anger. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was silence, patience, and the strength to wait for the right moment. Later that afternoon, Arthur found himself walking through the house again, this time with a sense of purpose. He didn't move through it like a man waiting to be evicted. He moved through it like a man who still belonged here, who still had a place in this world. He walked slowly, his cane tapping gently against the floorboards, taking in the familiar sights, the old lamp by the window, the bookshelves lined with memories, the family photographs on the wall. As he passed by the pictures of Caleb's childhood, he stopped for a moment, his fingers brushing against the glass. It felt like a lifetime ago, when Caleb had been a boy, eager for his father's approval, full of life and dreams. Arthur couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. That boy, the one he had raised, had been replaced by the man who now sat across from him with cold indifference. The boy who had once looked up to him had turned into someone who saw him as an obstacle. But Arthur wasn't angry anymore. He had spent so much of his life trying to fix things, trying to make everyone happy, trying to be the strong one. But now he understood that the only person he needed to answer to was himself. His strength didn't come from his ability to control the people around him. It came from his ability to control himself, to stay true to his values, even when the world around him was falling apart. As he continued walking, his gaze fell on the empty chair by the fireplace. Ruth's chair, the place where she used to sit every evening, knitting or reading, her presence a comforting constant in the room. Now the chair was empty, but Arthur felt her spirit in every corner of the house. It was as though she was still with him, reminding him that he was never truly alone. He could almost hear her voice in the quiet moments, urging him to be patient, to wait, to trust that everything would fall into place in time. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur believed it. He believed that things would work out, that he would find his way through the darkness and back into the light. As the days passed, the tension in the house slowly began to shift. Caleb and Mara, though still distant, no longer held the same sense of control over Arthur. He wasn't playing their game anymore. He wasn't going to bend to their will. Instead, he moved with purpose, quietly asserting his presence without needing to say a word. The silence between them had become a powerful tool, one that Arthur used to his advantage. He didn't need to yell or argue to make his point. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. The quietness of his resolve, the calm determination in his every movement, made it clear that he was not someone to be underestimated. He knew that Caleb and Mara were watching him, trying to figure out what he was going to do next. They had expected him to break, to give in to the pressure, to sign the papers and move out. But Arthur wasn't going to do that. He was going to stay. He was going to make them understand that they couldn't just push him around. The power of silence was not just in the absence of sound, it was in the way it made people listen. When you didn't speak, when you didn't react to the chaos around you, people began to wonder what you were thinking. They began to question their own assumptions, their own actions. Arthur had learned this lesson long ago. Ruth had always told him that silence was a powerful tool. It was a way to make people think, to make them second-guess their choices. And now, as he walked through the house, he knew that the silence was working in his favor. Arthur's mind kept returning to one thought: this is my home. He had built it with Ruth, he had raised his family here, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. The legal battles, the emotional pain, the betrayal, it was all part of the process, part of the journey that had brought him here. But Arthur wasn't finished yet. He had always been a man who believed in doing things the right way, in following the rules. But now he was ready to break the rules when necessary. He wasn't going to let his family erase him. He wasn't going to let them take away the one thing that mattered most to him. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about his legacy. This was about standing up for himself, even when the world was trying to push him down. He was going to prove that his value, his meaning, wasn't tied to a house or a piece of paper. It was tied to his spirit, his strength, and his ability to endure. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on.